Chapter 15. The Treasure in the Pool. For a few moments after Rod's words and Mukoki's signal from the cedars, Wabigoon sat as if stunned. "It isn't gold," he said, his voice filled with questioning doubt. "That's just what it is," declared Rod, his words now rising in the excitement which he was vainly striving to suppress. "It's hard, but see how your knife point has scratched it. It weighs 1/4 of an ounce. Are there any more nuggets in there?" He fell upon his knees beside Wabi, and their two heads were close together, their 4 eyes eagerly searching the contents of the pan, when Mukoki came up behind them. Rod passed the golden nugget to the old Indian and rose to his feet. "That settles it, boys. We've hit the right spot. Let's give 3 cheers for Johnball and the old map and go to dinner." "I agree to dinner, but cut out the cheers," said Wabi, "or else let's give them under our breath. Notice how hollow our voices sound in this chasm. I believe we could hear a shout 6 miles away." For their camp Mukoki had chosen a site in the edge of the cedars and had spread dinner on a big flat rock about which the 3 now gathered. For inspiration, as Wabi said, the young Indian placed the yellow nugget in the center of the improvised table, and if the enthusiasm with which they hurried through their meal counted for anything, there was great merit in the golden centerpiece. Mukoki joined the young gold seekers when they again returned to the chasm stream, and the quest of the yellow treasure was vigorously renewed in trembling and feverish expectancy. Only those who have lived in this quest and who have pursued that elusive ignis fatuus of all nations, the lure of gold, can realize the sensations which stir the blood and heat the brain of the treasure seeker as he dips his pan into the sands of the stream, where he believes nature has hidden her wealth. As Roderick Drew, a child of that civilization where the dollar is law as well as might, returned to the exciting work which promised him a fortune, he seemed to be in a half dream. About him, everywhere, was gold. For no moment did he doubt it. Not for an instant did he fear that there might be no more gold in the sand and gravel from which Wabigoon's nugget had come. Treasure was in the very sandbar under his feet. It was out there among the rocks, where the water beat itself angrily into sputtering froth. It was under the fall, and down in the chasm, everywhere, everywhere about him. In 1 month Johnball and his companions had gathered 27 pounds of it, a fortune of nearly $7,000. And they had gathered it here. Eagerly he scooped up a fresh pan of the precious earth. He heard the swish swish of the water in Wabigoon's and Mukoki's pans. But beyond this there were no sounds made by them. In these first minutes of treasure seeking no words were spoken. Who would give the first shout of discovery? 5 minutes, 10, 15 of them passed, and Rod found no gold. As he emptied his pan he saw Wabi scooping up fresh dirt. He, too, had failed. Mukoki had waded out waist deep among the rocks. A second and a third pan, and a little chill of disappointment cooled Rod's blood. Perhaps he had chosen an unlucky spot where the gold had not settled. He moved his position, and noticed that Wabigoon had done the same. A fourth and a fifth pan, and the result was the same. Mukoki had waded across the stream, which was shallow below the fall, and was working on the opposite side. A sixth pan, and Rod approached the young Indian. The excitement was gone out of their faces. An hour and a half, and no more gold. "Guess we haven't hit the right place after all," said Wabi. "It must be here," replied Rod. "Where there is one nugget there must be more. Gold is heavy and settles. Perhaps it's deeper down in the river bed." Mukoki came across to join them. Out among the rocks he had found a fleck of gold no larger than the head of a pin, and this new sign gave them all fresh enthusiasm. Taking off their boots, both Rod and Wabi joined the old pathfinder in midstream. But each succeeding pan added to the depressing conviction that was slowly replacing their hopes. The shadows in the chasm began growing longer and deeper. Far overhead the dense canopies of red pine shut out the last sun-glow of day, and the gathering gloom between the mountains gave warning that in this mysterious world of the ancient cabin the dusk of night was not far away. But not until they could no longer see the gleaming mica in their pans did the three cease work. Wet to the waist, tired, and with sadly shattered dreams, they returned to their camp. For a short time Rod's hopes were at their lowest ebb. Was it possible that there was no more gold? That the three adventurers of long ago had discovered a pocket here and worked it out? The thought had been growing in his head. Now it worried him. But his depression did not last long. The big fire which Mukoki built and the stimulating aroma of strong coffee revived his natural spirits, and both Wabi and he were soon laughing and planning again as they made their cedar bough shelter. Supper on the big flat stone, a feast of bear steak, hut stone biscuits, coffee, and that most delectable of all wilderness luxuries, a potato apiece, and the two irrepressible young gold hunters were once more scheming and building their air castles for the following day. Mukoki listened and attended to the clothes drying before the fire, now and then walking out into the gloom of the chasm to look up to where the white rim of the fall burst over the edge of the great rock above them. All that afternoon Wabi and Rod had forgotten the mad hunter and the strange, smoothly worn tree. Mukoki had not. In the glow of the campfire the two boys read over again the old account of Johnball and the two Frenchmen. The tiny slip of paper, yellow with age, was the connecting link between them and the dim and romantic past, a relic of the grim tragedy which these black and gloomy chasm walls would probably keep forever a secret. 27 pounds, repeated Rod, as if half to himself. That was 1 month's work. Pretty nearly a pound a day, gasped Wabi. I tell you, Rod, we haven't hit the right spot yet. I wonder why John Ball's share was twice that of his companions. Do you suppose it was because he discovered the gold in the first place? Speculated Rod. In all probability it was. That accounts for his murder. The Frenchmen were getting the small end of the deal. 1859, mused Rod. That was 49 years ago, before the Great Civil War. Say. He stopped and looked hard at Wabigoon. Did it ever strike you that John Ball might not have been murdered? Wabi leaned forward with more than usual eagerness. I have had a thought, he began. What? That perhaps he was not killed, and that after the two Frenchmen died in the knife duel he returned and got the gold, continued Rod. No, I had not thought of that, said Wabi. Suddenly he rose to his feet and joined Mukoki out in the gloom of the chasm. Rod was puzzled. Something in his companion's voice, in his face and words, disturbed him. What had Wabigoon meant? The young Indian soon rejoined him, but he spoke no more of John Ball. When the two boys went to their blankets, Mukoki still remained awake. For a long time he sat beside the fire, his hands gripping the rifle across his knees, his head slightly bowed in that statue-like posture so characteristic of the Indian. For fully an hour he sat motionless, and in his own way he was deeply absorbed in thought. Soon after their discovery of the first golden bullet, Wabigoon had whispered a few words into his ear, unknown to Rod, and tonight out in the gloom of the chasm he had repeated those same words. They had set Mukoki's mind working. He was thinking now of something that happened long ago, when, in his reasoning, the wilderness was young and he was a youth. In those days his one great treasure was a dog, and one winter he went with this faithful companion far into the hunting regions of the north, a long moon's travel from his village. When he returned, months later, he was alone. From his lonely hunting shack deep in the solitudes his comrade had disappeared, and had never returned. This all happened before Mukoki met the pretty Indian girl who became his wife, and was afterward killed by the wolves, and he missed the dog as he would have missed a human brother. The Indian's love, even for brutes, is something that lives, and more than 20 moons later, 2 years in the life of a man, he returned once again to the old shack, and there he found Wholdaia, the dog. The animal knew him, and bounded about on 3 legs for joy, and because of the missing leg Mukoki understood why he had not returned to him 2 years before. 2 years is a long time in the life of a dog, and the gray hairs of suffering and age were freely sprinkled in Wholdaia's muzzle and along his spine. Mukoki was not thinking of Wholdaia without a reason. He was thinking of Wabigoon's words, and the mad hunter. Could not the mad hunter do as Wholdaia had done? Was it possible that the bad dog man who shot golden bullets and who screamed like a lynx was the man who had lived there many, many years ago, and whom the boys called Johnball? Those were the thoughts that Wabi had set working in his brain. The young Indian had not suggested this to Rod. He had spoken of it to Mukoki only because he knew the old pathfinder might help him to solve the riddle, and so he had started Mukoki upon the trail. The next morning, while the others were finishing their breakfast, Mukoki equipped himself for a journey. "Go down chasm," he explained to Rod. "Fine where get out to plain. Shoot meat." That day the gold hunters were more systematic in their work, beginning close to the fall, one on each side of the stream, and panning their way slowly down the chasm. By noon they had covered 200 yards, and their only reward was a tiny bit of gold, worth no more than $1, which Rod had found in his pan. By the time darkness again compelled them to stop, they had prospected a quarter of a mile downstream without discovering other signs of Johnball's treasure. In spite of their failure, they were less discouraged than the previous evening, for this failure, in a way, was having a sedative and healthful effect. It convinced them that there was a hard and perhaps long task ahead of them, and that they could not expect to find their treasure winnowed in yellow piles for them. Early in the evening Mukoki returned laden with caribou meat, and with the news that the first break in the chasm walls was fully 5 miles below. The adventurers now regretted that they had chopped down the stub, for it was decided that the next work should be in the stream above the fall, which would necessitate a 10-mile tramp, 5 miles to the break and 5 miles back. When the journey was begun at dawn the following morning, several days' supplies were taken along, and also a stout rope by means of which the gold hunters could lower themselves back into their old camp when their work above was completed. Rod noticed that the rocks in the stream seemed much larger than when he had first seen them, and he mentioned the fact to Wabigoon. "The floods are going down rapidly," explained the young Indian. "All of the snow is melted from the sides of the mountains, and there are no lakes to feed this chasm stream. Within a week there won't be more than a few inches of water below the fall." "And that is when we shall find the gold!" declared Rod with his old enthusiasm. "I tell you we haven't gone deep enough. This gold has been here for centuries and centuries, and it has probably settled several feet below the surface of the river bed. Ball and the Frenchman found 27 pounds in June when the creek was practically dry. Did you ever read about the discoveries of gold in Alaska and the Yukon?" "A little, when I was going to school with you." "Well, the richest finds were nearly always from 3 to a dozen feet under the surface, and when a prospector found signs in surface panning, he knew there was rich dirt below. We'll find our gold in this chasm and near the fall." Rod's confidence was the chief thing that kept up the spirits of the treasure seekers during the next few days, for not the first sign of gold was discovered above the fall. Yard by yard the prospectors worked up the chasm until they washed its sands for more than a mile. And with the passing of each day, as Wabigoon had predicted, the stream became more and more shallow, until they could wade across it without wetting themselves above their knees. At the close of the 4th day the three lowered themselves over the face of the rock into the second chasm. So convinced was Rod in his belief that the gold was hidden deep down under the creek bed that he dug a 4-foot hole by torchlight, and that night after supper washed out several pans of dirt in the glow of the campfire. He still found no signs of gold. The next day's exertions left no room for doubt. Beyond 2 or 3 tiny flecks of gold, the three adventurers found nothing of value in the deeper sand and gravel of the stream. That night absolute dejection settled on the camp. Both Rod and Wabigoon made vain efforts to liven up their drooping spirits. Only Mukoki, to whom gold carried but a fleeting and elusive value, was himself, and even his hopefulness was dampened by the gloom of his companions. Rod could see but one explanation of their failure. Somewhere near the cataract, Johnball and the Frenchman had found a rich pocket of gold, and they had worked it out, probably before the fatal tragedy in the old cabin. "But how about the mad hunter and his golden bullets?" insisted Wabi, in another effort to brighten their prospects. "The bullets weighed an ounce each, and I'll stake my life they came from this chasm. He knows where the gold is, if we don't." "Come back soon," grunted Mukoki. "Watch him, find gold." "That's what we'll do!" cried the young Indian, jumping suddenly to his feet and toppling Rod backward off the rock upon which he was sitting. "Come, cheer up, Rod! The gold is here, somewhere, and we're going to find it. I'm heartily ashamed of you, you whom I thought would never get discouraged." Rod was laughing when he recovered from the playful mauling which Wabi administered before he could regain his feet. "That's right, I deserve another licking. We've got all the spring and summer before us, and if we don't find the gold by the time snow flies, we'll come back and try it again next year. What do you say?" "And bring Minnetaki with us," added Wabi, jumping into the air and kicking his heels together. "How will you like that, Rod?" He nudged his comrade in the ribs, and in another moment both were puffing and laughing in one of their good-natured wrestling bouts, in which the cat-like agility of the young Indian always won for him in the end. In spite of momentary times like this, when the natural buoyancy and enthusiasm of the young adventurers rose above their discouragement, the week that followed added to their general depression. For miles the chasm was explored, and at the end of the week they had found less than an ounce of gold. If their pans had given them no returns at all, their disappointment would have been less, for then, as Wabi said, they could have given up the ghost with good grace. But the few precious yellow grains which they found now and then lured them on, as these same grains have lured other hundreds and thousands since the dawn of civilization. Day after day they persisted in their efforts. Night after night about their campfire they inspired each other with new hope and made new plans. The spring sun grew stronger, the poplar buds burst into tiny leaf, and out beyond the walls of the chasm the first promises of summer came in the sweetly scented winds of the south, redolent with the breath of balsam and pine and the thousand growing things of the plains. But at last the search came to an end. For 3 days not even a grain of gold had been found. Around the big rock where they were eating dinner, Rod and his friends came to a final conclusion. The following morning they would break camp, and leaving their canoe behind, for the creek was now too shallow for even birch-bark navigation, they would continue their exploration of the chasm in search of other adventures. The whole summer was ahead of them, and though they had failed in discovering a treasure where Johnball and the Frenchman had succeeded, they might find one farther on. At least the trip deeper into the unexplored wilderness would be filled with excitement. Mukoki rose to his feet, leaving Rod and Wabi still discussing their plans. Suddenly he turned toward them, and a startled cry fell from his lips, while with one long arm he pointed beyond the fall into the upper chasm. "Listen! Him! Him!" The old warrior's face twitched with excitement, and for a full half-minute he stood motionless, his arms still extended, his black eyes staring steadily at Rod and Wabigoon, who sat as silent as the rocks about them. Then there came to them from a great distance a quavering, thrilling sound, a sound that filled them again with the old horror of the upper chasm, the cry of the mad hunter. At that distant cry Wabigoon sprang to his feet, his eyes leaping fire, his bronzed cheeks whitening in an excitement even greater than that of Mukoki. "Muky, I told you!" he cried. "I told you!" The young Indian's body quivered, his hands were clenched, and when he turned upon Rod the white youth was startled by the look in his face. "Rod, John Ball is coming back to his gold!" Hardly had he spoken the words when the tenseness left his body and his hands dropped to his side. The words shot from him before he could control himself enough to hold them back. In another moment he was sorry. The thought that John Ball and the mad hunter were the same person he had kept to himself, until for reasons of his own he had let Mukoki into his secret. While the idea had taken larger and larger growth in his mind, he knew that from every logical point of view the thing was impossible, and that constraint which came of the Indian blood in him held him from discussing it with Rod. But now the words were out. A quick flush replaced the whiteness that had come into his face. In another instant he was leaning eagerly toward Rod, his eyes kindling into fire again. He had not expected the change that he now saw come over the white youth. "I have been thinking that for a long time," he continued. "Ever since we found the footprints in the sand. There's just one proof that we need, just one, and listen!" Rod fairly hissed the word as he held up a warning hand. This time the cry of the mad hunter came to them more distinctly. He was approaching through the upper chasm. The white youth rose to his feet, his eyes steadily fixed upon Wabigoon's. His face was deathly pale. "John Ball!" he repeated, as if he had just heard what the other had said. "John Ball!" What seemed to him to be the only truth swept upon him like a flood, and for a score of seconds, in every one of which he could hear his heart thumping excitedly, he stood like one stunned. John Ball! John Ball returned to life to find their gold for them, to tell them of the tragedy and mystery of those days long dead and gone. Like powder touched by a spark of fire, his imagination leaped at Wabi's thrilling suggestion. Mukoki set to work. "Hide!" he exclaimed. "Hide thees. He pointed about him at all the things in camp. Both of the boys understood. "He must see no signs of our presence from the top of the fall," cried Wabi, gathering an armful of camp utensils. "Hide them back among the cedars." Mukoki hurried to the cedar bough shelter and began tearing it down. For 5 minutes the adventurers worked on the run. Once during that time they heard the madman's wailing cry, and hardly had they finished and concealed themselves in the gloom of the old cabin when it came again, this time from not more than a rifle shot's distance beyond the cataract. It was not a scream that now fell from the mad hunter's lips, but a low wail, and in it there was something that drove the old horror from the 3 wildly beating hearts and filled them with a measureless, nameless pity. What change had come over the madman? The cry was repeated every few seconds now, each time nearer than before, and in it there was a questioning, appealing note that seemed to end in sobbing despair, a something that gripped at Rod's heart and filled him with a great half-mastering impulse to answer it, to run out and stretch his hands forth in greeting to the strange wild creature coming down the chasm. Then, as he looked, something ran out upon the edge of the great rock beside the cataract, and he clutched at his own breast to hold back what he thought must burst forth in words. For he knew, as surely as he knew that Wabi was at his side, that he was looking upon John Ball. For a moment the strange creature crouched where the stub had been, and when he saw that it was gone he stood erect, and a quavering, pitiful cry echoed softly through the chasm. And as he stood there motionless, the watchers saw that the mad hunter was an old man, tall and thin, but as straight as a sapling, and that his head and breast were hidden in shaggy beard and hair. In his hands he carried a gun, the gun that had fired the golden bullets, and even at that distance those who were peering from the gloom of the cabin saw that it was a long-barreled weapon similar to those they had found in the other old cabin, along with the skeletons of the Frenchmen who had died in the fatal knife duel. In breathless suspense the 3 waited, not a muscle of their bodies moving. Again the old man leaned over the edge of the rock, and his voice came to them in a moaning, sobbing appeal, and after a little he stretched out his arms, still crying softly, as if beseeching help from some one below. The spectacle gripped at Rod's soul. A hot film came into his eyes, and there was an odd little tremble in his throat. The Indians were looking with dark, staring eyes. To them this was another unusual incident of the wilderness. But to Rod it was the white man's soul crying out to his own. The old man's outstretched arms seemed reaching to him. The sobbing voice, filled with its pathos, its despair, its hopeless loneliness, seemed a supplication for him to come forth, to reach up his own arms, to respond to this lost soul of the solitudes. With a little cry Rod darted between his companions. He threw off his cap and lifted his white face to the startled creature on the rock, and as he advanced step by step, reaching out his hands in friendship, he called softly a name. "John Ball! John Ball! John Ball!" In an instant the mad hunter had straightened himself, half turned to flee. "John Ball! Hello, John Ball! John Ball!" In his earnestness Rod was almost sobbing the name. He forgot everything now, everything but that lonely figure on the rock, and he drew nearer and nearer, gently calling the name, until the mad hunter dropped on his knees, and, crumpled in his long beard and gray lynx skin, looked down upon Rod and sent back a low moaning, answering cry. "Johnball! Johnball, is that you?" Rod stopped, with the madman 40 feet above him, and something seemed choking back the very breath in him when he saw the strange look that had come into the old man's eyes. "Johnball!" The wild eyes above shifted for a moment. They caught a glimpse of 2 heads thrust from the door of the old cabin, and the madman sprang to his feet. For a breath he stood on the edge of the rock, then with a cry he leaped with the fierce agility of an animal far out into the swirl of the cataract. For an instant he was visible in the downward plunge of the water. Another instant, and with a heavy splash, he disappeared in the deep pool under the fall. Wabi and Mukoki had seen the desperate leap, and the young Indian was beside the pool before Rod had recovered from his horrified astonishment. For centuries the water of the chasm stream had been tumbling into this pool, wearing it deeper and deeper each year, until the water in it was over a man's head. In width it was not more than a dozen feet. "Watch for him! He'll drown if we don't get him out!" shouted Wabi. Rod leaped to the edge of the pool, with Mukoki between him and Wabigoon. Ready to spring into the cold depths at the first sign of the old man's gray head or struggling arms, the 3 stood with every muscle ready for action. A second, 2 seconds, 5 seconds passed, and there was no sign of him. Rod's heart began to beat with drum-like fierceness. 10 seconds. A quarter of a minute. He looked at Wabigoon. The young Indian had thrown off his caribou skin coat. His eyes, as he turned them for a moment toward Rod, flashed back the white youth's fear. "I'm going to dive for him!" In another instant he had plunged head foremost into the pool. Mukoki's coat fell to the ground. He crouched forward until it seemed he must topple from the stone upon which he stood. Another 15 seconds, and Wabigoon's head appeared above the water, and the old warrior gave a shout. "Me come!" He shot out and disappeared in a huge splash close to Wabi. Rod stood transfixed, filled with a fear that was growing in him at every breath he drew. He saw the convulsions of the water made by the 2 Indians, who were groping about below the surface. Wabigoon came up again for breath, then Mukoki. It seemed to him that an age had passed, and he felt no hope. Johnball was dead. Not for a moment now did he doubt the identity of the mad hunter. The strange, wistful light that had replaced the glare in the old man's eyes when he heard his own name called to him had spoken more than words. It was John Ball. And he was dead. For a 3rd time, a 4th, and a 5th, Mukoki and Wabigoon came up for air, and the 5th time they dragged themselves out upon the rocks that edged the pool. Mukoki spoke no word but ran back to the camp and threw a great armful of dry fuel upon the fire. Wabigoon still remained at the edge of the pool, dripping and shivering. His hands were clenched, and Rod could see that they were filled with sand and gravel. Mechanically the Indian opened his fingers and looked at what he had unconsciously brought up from under the fall. For a moment he stared. Then, with his gasping breath, there came a low, thrilling cry. He held out his hands to Rod. Gleaming richly among the pebbles which he held was a nugget of pure gold. A nugget so large that Rod gave a wild yell, and in that one moment forgot that John Ball, the mad hunter, was dead or dying beneath the fall. End of chapter 15. Recording by Roger Moline.